government. I mean, isn't that ultimately, in my defense, a pretty reasonable assumption? And what else was true in my defense is that if you look at the debates in the 1990s under the Clinton administration, we forget about this now, they sort of faded from memory, but the debates that we had in the 1990s about civil liberties weren't all that different from the debates that we had after 2001, after 9/11, under the Bush years. Because what happened was when the terrorist attack on Oklahoma City took place, Bill Clinton stood up and said that this is a threat for which we are extremely unprepared, the threat of domestic terrorism. And in order to protect ourselves from this threat, we need to significantly increase federal law enforcement authorities and federal surveillance authorities and federal investigative powers. And the things he proposed were things like increasing the ability of the federal government to eavesdrop on electronic communication, on the nascent internet industry that had been enabling people to communicate online, by prohibiting companies from creating any products that would allow you to encrypt your communications so that the government couldn't invade them. He wanted there to be a law that said that any communications had to be subject to decryption by federal agencies. He wanted to empower the FISA court so that he could eavesdrop more broadly on the communications of American citizens. There were a whole variety of measures that he wanted to introduce in order to increase the ability of law enforcement to keep us all safe from this new terrorist menace. And the people who stood up and objected most loudly were not Democrats, with a few exceptions. They were conservatives, the people who said, we believe in small government, we believe in liberty, and these things are too threatening to empower Bill Clinton with. And in fact, the leader of that effort was a senator from Missouri, a Republican senator from Missouri, whose name was John Ashcroft. He wrote op-ed after op-ed that you can go and read. I mean, it's unbelievable. He sounds like he's the executive director of the ACLU, talking about how safety is one important goal of the government, but it's by no means the most important. And our country was predicated on the concept that we agree to give up safety in exchange for liberty. And one of those crucial liberties is that the government cannot invade our private communications unless it demonstrates to a court that there's probable cause to believe that we did something wrong. That was John Ashcroft. And 2 years later, that same John Ashcroft was the Attorney General of the Bush administration, who not only agreed that the president could eavesdrop on all of our communications without any warrants of any kind, but who went before Congress in early 2002 and said that anyone who objects to anti-terrorist actions on the part of the government by citing the Constitution or civil liberties is aiding and abetting al-Qaeda. And that transformation from civil liberties champion to blind authoritarian that you see in John Ashcroft and so many other people on the right happened not because of 9/11. It happened because people believe that when there's a Democrat in the White House controlling the executive branch, that's really dangerous. And you need all kinds of safeguards and all kinds of protections and all kinds of oversight to prevent abuse. But when their party is in power, when there's a good Republican who's well-intentioned and kind-hearted, who's occupying these instruments, you no longer need those safeguards. Now they don't matter. You can trust them to exercise them in the dark because they'll do it for the good. And so this belief in civil liberties was completely conditional upon which party controlled the White House. Now, people like to laugh when I tell that story because it makes the Republicans look like unprincipled, idiotic hypocrites, which they are. But what's not quite as funny is that the same exact reversal happens in terms of Democrats who proclaim to be civil libertarians, and concerned with that list that we talked about at the beginning. So I know when I began writing about all the awful things that George Bush was doing, I found universal approval and support among every person, virtually, who identified as a Democrat or a liberal. They were saying, oh, absolutely, what you're doing is so important. The Bush administration is shredding the Constitution, waging a war on all our basic liberties. This is absolutely awful. And that critique was found so prominently among not just liberals in the Democratic Party, but the Democratic Party itself. In fact, Barack Obama ran for president with the plank that he would restore civil liberties and reverse these abuses, not as a side plank to placate civil libertarians and other fringe groups, but as a centerpiece of his campaign, that we would restore our legal values and our constitutional values and stay safe without engaging in these kind of extremist views. This was a centerpiece of the Democrats' political identity for 8 years when the Republicans were in office. And what happened when Barack Obama got into office and began embracing those very same policies that we'll discuss in a moment? All of those concerns essentially disappeared. You no longer hear prominent national Democratic politicians talking about things like shredding the Constitution, or excesses of executive power, or abuses of surveillance, or departures from the Constitution, because just like Republicans, who believed that those things were only necessary and important when the other party was in power, Democrats also believed that those things were a concern only when big bad George Bush and Dick Cheney could do bad things, but not when the good, kind-hearted, magnanimous Barack Obama is at the helm. Now you can trust them to do the right thing. And this mindset, this conditional belief in the Constitution and civil liberties, is really quite destructive. And I just want to highlight a couple of the reasons why as I sort of wrap up my view of these issues. Because this to me really goes to the heart of why this list matters so much, this list of prohibitions on what the government is supposed to be barred from doing. First of all, there is no such thing as a magnanimous leader who is immune from the temptations to abuse power. That does not exist. And the founders had an extremely high opinion of themselves. If you look at the way that George James Madison and Thomas Jefferson talked about themselves, they believed themselves to be not just the elite, not just the super educated, but noble and enlightened. That's what they actually thought about themselves. They were men of the Enlightenment and were grounded in the belief that they had discovered the fruits of rationality that were going to serve as the basis for our government. And by and large that was true, but as high of an opinion as they had of themselves, they also knew and said that there is no such thing as vesting this awesome power of government in individuals, no matter how well intentioned they are, and have them and be able to trust that they won't abuse it. Abuse of that power is inevitable by the very idea of what human nature is. That's why those safeguards are needed, and needed in every case, not because you assess whether a particular leader needs them, but because we know that all leaders do. And so if you ever hear anybody saying, well, I'm less concerned now because I like this person in power than I was when that other person was in power, that is a distortion of the very idea of civil liberties. Anyone who thinks that way is inevitably giving birth to massive, massive abuses of power. The second reason why that mentality is so dangerous is because there's no such thing as vesting power in one president and then having it magically taken away whenever somebody else succeeds him who you don't like quite as much. Once you vest power in the president, you vested it in that office. This is something that a lot of us used to try constantly to tell Bush followers and Bush supporters in order to get them to care about the abuses that were occurring, which was, look, we know that George Bush is a wonderful Christian man who would never abuse these powers in any way, shape, or form. That's a given. He only would use them purely for good and proper purposes. But think about what happens when that wicked witch Hillary Clinton gets into office, which is what they all thought would happen. Do you actually want her being able to eavesdrop on your conversations without warrants, or order American citizens imprisoned without due process? It didn't work at all. They were just content that they were going to be in power forever and figured they would deal with that problem then. And it doesn't work now either when I hear Democrats and progressives defending Obama's theory of power that he can compile hit lists of American citizens to order the CIA to assassinate far from any battlefield without due process, or to continue the system of imprisoning people without due process. What I say to those people is, of course Barack Obama, being the good, kind-hearted, magnanimous man that he is, would never abuse this power, but what about President Sarah Palin? Do you actually want her being able to compile hit lists of American citizens without due process? And so far, that hasn't worked either, but it should, because these powers, once vested, become permanent. The final reason why that is such a destructive mentality, this conditional belief in civil liberties, is because the way our political discourse works is that policies get debated only when one of the parties is for them and one of the parties is against them. Cable news shows and newspapers aren't interested in the issues where both parties agree. The reason why there was so little real examination about whether or not we ought to really attack Iraq, whether or not they really had weapons of mass destruction, is because the leadership of the Republican and Democratic parties both agreed that there were weapons of mass destruction and that we were therefore justified in invading Iraq. And so to newspapers and cable news shows, that's really boring. There's nothing to talk about. If both parties agree, it's definitely true. And if you ask reporters, well, why didn't you investigate those theories more? Why didn't you investigate whether or not those things were really true? They'll tell you, well, no Democrats were contesting it and very few Republicans were as well, and so what could I do? That's just the way our political discourse works. Once something becomes bipartisan consensus, it gets removed from the realm of what we debate and what we discuss. And so what you see with these civil libertarian policies is exactly that. These extremist, radical theories of executive power, as recently as 2 years ago when Barack Obama was running for president, were deemed to be the province of right-wing radicalism. They were George Bush and Dick Cheney's nightmares, satanic spawns. And because of that, because Democrats were opposed to them vigorously and were contesting them and vowing to uproot them, there was a lot of divisiveness that it created. It created a lot of dissension in the citizenry. People were angry over torture and limitless imprisonment and Guantanamo and excessive secrecy. And what has happened because Barack Obama has adopted those policies is that now they are no longer right-wing radicalism or the province of Bush and Cheney. Now they have become the consensus policy of both political parties, of the political class. There is nobody in Washington anymore with an establishment platform who opposes these things because the Republicans can't because they did it, and the Democrats can't because they're doing it. And so now things like imprisonment without due process-free assassination, the state secrets privilege to shield presidential lawbreaking from judicial review, and the panoply of policies that Obama has enacted that he once vehemently criticized when he was a senator and then a candidate, have really become taken off the table for what it is that we now debate. And that, more than anything, guarantees that they will endure for a long time. That's the irony of the Barack Obama presidency in this area, is that he not only failed to comport with his promises to reverse these things, by rendering them bipartisan, he has done more to strengthen them and institutionalize them and entrench them than anything George Bush or Dick Cheney on their own could possibly have ever accomplished or did accomplish.